Rutro. It is, excuse me, it is Wednesday, March 22nd, 2023. This is the Crypto Flight Path edition for FOMC Day. And what a day it will probably be,
Yeah,
with
another
lots of
day.
uncertainty.
Yeah, another day. Everybody clambers around and waits for some Fed guy to decide whether he's going to raise rates or not. I mean, I get so tired of this. Like, you know, I don't care. I saw a great tweet, and there was a guy that said, 99% of people. He basically his point was it's harder to be Stan Druckenmiller than it is to be Warren Buffett, right? Because this past year, everybody's been trying to focus on macro, and 99% of people don't have an edge in macro. And it's not going to help them. So you're better off just studying assets that you like and buying those assets, irrespective of what's going on with the Fed over the long term. And that resonated with me because it's just like, yeah, I follow macro, I pay attention to it, probably no more than the next guy, but I haven't gotten a bit of edge from following all this garbage, right? Like it's just, you know, it's very like overwhelming and consuming. But at the end of the day, I'm not using macro necessarily to make my decisions, right?
Yeah, talk about overwhelming. Yes. So what's interesting about the the macro lens, or I think the thing I'm trying to spit out here is that it's it's with Bitcoin and things being global in nature, just like the U.S. dollar is the global reserve currency today. Until that changes, I don't know if that'll happen or when that'll happen. But the the rise of digital assets globally is threatening a lot of things, and it's hard for us to see those things because a lot of those institutions like the JP Morgans and people in institutions in the banking sector especially, they see this digital asset thing as a threat to their payments business, as they probably well should. And so there's 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 corporate politics in play, there's interpersonal politics in play. There's people who are worried about their positions and their station in life and the their career paths. And if what happens if they talk about Bitcoin, for example, and what happens, do the people in their sphere that they have to operate, do they risk being ostracized from their jobs, or they're being fired or something to that effect? So there are just so many ways that digital assets and the changing nature of the fact that change is it's not just coming, it's already here, it's already happening. And where you fall on the spectrum of how you perceive that change and what you think about it and what you're going to do about it, or if you're going to do anything about it, and how you behave and how you provide for yourself. And I think that's another interesting layer that I, I find myself referring back to often, is who stands to win and who stands to lose, and what are the consequences of being either or speaking your mind about these things. And that, to weave this back into what we're talking about, is that it trying to keep track of or look at the macro landscape as it, and then filter it down to where you are today, and like what you're, if you're just a working stiff like me and you're trying to just stay afloat and try to just stay a little bit ahead, how does looking at macro help? And it, in some cases, I would argue it probably doesn't help very much. It probably is more of a distraction, if you're not really, if one is not interested in how these things work. But I think that there's potentially a place for a macro view in one's investment of, or in the way that one goes about crafting and constructing a thesis on how they want to protect, preserve, and grow their wealth, should that be something they're interested in doing.
No, and I
So anyway, that
think,
was.
yeah, you have to pay attention to it. Like, and we talk about that. quite a bit that you have to pay attention to macro. It's got to be in your kind of vision when you're doing an investment thesis. But that doesn't mean you can't get tired of it. And I think to your point of
Yeah.
uh, with these banks, crypto, yeah, the technology's already here, and it's like the analogy of the horse, right? Through no fault of the horse, it became obsolete when the car was invented, all right, because the car was a better means of transportation. It's the same thing with these banks, right? And it's proving to be true that Bitcoin is a better bank than some of these banks, right? And that technology exists. It's happening right now, and I think we're in the stage of they're fighting now. They're pushing back against it, but at the end of the day, it's counterproductive. In my opinion, what these banks should be doing is embracing the technology, right, and trying to incorporate it into their business models, however way they can, instead of fighting what's going to be inevitable, in my opinion. But that being said, the, Bitcoin's hanging out at 28. What are we at? 28.3. We are, despite everything, despite all these macro factors, Bitcoin's bounced off the lows and continues to be, you know, fastest race in the horse, the fastest horse in the
Yeah.
race.
Fastest. Yeah, I got you. I still knew what you meant. That's
Yeah.
that's even funnier to me is that
Well, it's funny that I caught it, right?
the all good things that you just articulated is that the despite all of the issues that presented themselves last year, the FTX, the Terra Lunas, the Voyagers, the Celsiuses, and I mean, just walk the list. I don't need to like FTX is as kind of like everything in that bundle, the collective wet blanket that got thrown on like these things, these digital assets, this space, the all of the attention that was I try to remember that when the media, like the mainstream media, have a business to run. So remember this: the mainstream media have a business to run, and the things that they choose to cover, there's a couple of there's a couple of fundamental ingredients that are necessary. Is that the they have a very big audience or mouth to feed. That if they miss a beat, even in the slight, even if they get it just a little bit wrong, the consequences are pretty severe because their audience will go somewhere else to get what they want, and they want to be they want to be entertained more than anything else, and they want it now, and they want to feel like they're in the know. If you ask the average person what like and I've talked with people like family members about this, like, why do you watch the news? It's always so negative. Like, well, I just, and you hear all this rationalization coming out. Like, well, I just want to make sure I'm staying plugged into what's going on in the world. And the reality is, we as human beings want to feel connected to things. And I get it. It's an important facet in life to feel connected and all this other great stuff. But the point I'm trying to get to is that there are hundreds of millions of people around the world that feel somewhat similar, and that's who the mainstream media are. That's their customer. And if you think about it that way, then it starts to make a little more sense. And the thing I'm trying to get to, the point I'm trying to illustrate simply is that even though this last year's news cycle was pretty nasty and there were a lot of unfortunate things that happened, it was, I think about the fact that the mainstream media chose to throw as much shade as they did. And I think that the silver lining here is that, like, all news or bad news is still good news in some respects, and because people are learning, they're learning about crypto, they're learning about Bitcoin, especially during these times. So I spent most of a whole year of just people getting Bitcoin this, Bitcoin that, crypto this, crypto that. But with the grain of salt that a statistically significant number of people take these things that they hear, what's likely to have happened is that they started doing their own research, maybe, and you saw, with greater attention and greater knowledge being spread across the masses of what these things are, savvy the savvy businesses like the Fidelities of the world got their act together, in my opinion, and opened up their customer base to be able to participate in the ecosystem directly, and which is that didn't get the same level of attention in the mainstream as all of the nastiness, but still, I think that that's potentially a byproduct, or you may be able to map it back somehow, and be very selective and choosy about how you make the connections. But I think that despite all of the FUD, uh, that more and more people have come to know about Bitcoin and all the other types of crypto projects out there. This idea of digital assets, this idea of transacting outside of the traditional finance system, and now with the mayhem and all of the big popularized bank failures, this splinter of doubt, the seeds of wait a minute, something ain't right here, is now the pendulum is now swinging the other way. So maybe I'm wearing rose-colored glasses, or I'm just like an eternal optimist, but I still think that there's something good that's coming out of all of this nastiness, and the the macro pendulum is swinging the other way now, in my opinion.
Yeah, we'll definitely see. What do you think they're going to do today? Are they going to raise or not? I have no idea. Frankly, you know, I don't. I pay attention to it. I know that they're doing it. We'll see what happens. I mean, there's nothing you can really do but speculate until it happens. There's a lot
Oh
of
yeah.
people saying they really need to cut rates, uh, but my guess, my thought would be that they've put themselves in a position where they can't do that right now. My bet would be 25 basis points, but you just saw in United Kingdom that they had an inflation number come out that was way higher than they thought it would be. Uh, so going to be hard for them to cut rates. But again, do they actually have this under control? Right? Like that's the thing, and that's kind of the bet too here with Bitcoin is that you know I don't know that they do, right? And so the banks are supposedly safe. The Fed supposedly has inflation under control, and like you can talk about inflation being a lagging indicator, and that it's already come down, and there's two different types of inflation. I don't really want to get into all that to be honest with you right now,
Hmm.
but I'm saying it's nuanced, right? There's complexities to it, but here we are again. We've been doing this for over a year now. It's another Fed decision, and everybody's glued to the TV to decide, what they're going to do, right? And I just think I think it becomes to the point. I guess what I'm saying that at some point people stop paying attention to them, right? And I don't know that that's now. I don't know if it, you know, whatever, but you know, I have essentially like whether they raise 25 basis points or 50 basis points is not going to affect my decision to buy more Bitcoin in the slightest.
Right, and I think a lot of I think depending on who you are and what your level of involvement in the financial system, whether if you're like, for example, if you're just you work and your 401k contribution or your IRA contribution is set on autopilot, you're you're hitting the bid, as they say, every 2 weeks, or bi-monthly, or every quarter, whatever the cadence is for your contribution. You're a buyer at any price. That's something that a lot of people don't think about. Doesn't matter that they don't think about, but the real life is that even when stocks are coming down, for example, there's a bid, and it's the working folk who are thinking about their retirement, and they're contributing, and they're not focused on whether or not they don't even know who the Federal Reserve Chair is if you ask them, and they don't understand
Well, that's
and
a
don't
problem,
care.
right? Yeah, that's a problem, and that's what you gotta learn about this stuff, right? And that's what Bitcoin made me do, anyways. It made me pay
Yep.
attention to all this stuff, even if it's stuff that getting into Bitcoin and crypto. The last thing I want to do is talk about Federal Reserve, right? Like that goes on to a greater picture and what they're doing on a day to day basis because I've essentially made the decision that I've opted out of that system to the best of my ability, right? Because I see the flaws. Flaws are becoming more present every day. And that's something that, you have to decide for yourself if that's right for you. But I just find it interesting that every month we're sitting here having the same discussion, and all these pundits on TV get up there and say the same things, and a lot of the times they end up being wrong, and people still turn on the TV and look for information. And it's just kind of like, you have to be able to kind of separate, say, like noise from signal, right? Like that's
Hmm.
that's that's hard for a lot of people to do when they're first starting out, because they make it so complex, and they make it complex on purpose, right? Like they use big words, they use, not that not that people can't understand big words, but you know, the language they use is purposely complex to describe simple things. They use words that they don't need to use. The only reason they do it is to obfuscate, you know, real information. But uh, it's interesting to think about. But what's your bet? Do you think
I
25,
think
50, 0?
25 is what I think will happen. And it's but not because we need a 25 basis point increase, in my opinion. What I think is, just like in Europe, they stuck to the script. Despite all of the other things, they still raised interest rates because the what I've learned working at the fund was that there there's a very large number of market participants at the institutional level, like the the professional level. Uh, there's this idea that the Fed is somehow going to give the impression that they will cut rates to keep the stock market from coming back down appreciably, because people's retirements they'll start. So what happens is, when stocks puke over like a period of time, and people get their quarterly statements from Schwab or whoever, and they look at it and they see how much they're down, unrealized, of course. And they get on the what happens is, 500,000 or more plus people get on the phone to their brokers or their administrators of their retirement plans, and they give them an earful and they say, I want you to get me out of this crap. And it creates this flurry of activity where people start to panic. And the the point I'm trying to get to is that I've read as much, and I've heard other previous Fed chairs and previous Fed talking heads talk about how they're not going to blink, and they're not going to let the markets dictate policy, and it becomes this quote unquote standoff between the Federal Reserve and the people that have the influence over the stock market, for example, in the U.S., because that's how people unfortunately measure whether or not they think that the stock market going up is good, is the economy's doing well. And what they're really saying is that my portfolio is up in unrealized terms. But I think the to get back to the point, I think they have to raise today, not just because they want to not be seen to capitulate or blink, but also remember they had rolled off a bunch of the balance sheet, meaning they had tightened a little bit. And now, with all of this Fed window borrowing and all this extra money being pumped into the system to keep it alive or keep things propped up, that we're right back in the same boat we were before, where there's too much money in the system, perhaps. I mean, depending on who you are, you may agree with that, you may disagree with that. But the point is, I think they're going to have to raise. And I think the best way to illustrate is, somebody on Twitter said they got their foot on the gas with the QE, the not a bailout, not quantitative easing, and they also have their foot on the brake at the same time, with wanting to raise by 25. So I think we get the 25 basis points, and we get a bunch of blah blah blah. Well, we had to do this blah blah because inflation is still a problem when we're not at our target, and there'll be all this jaw flapping and horse crap. And I think
Well,
that
we'll
that's what
see.
happens.
We'll see. I mean, the analogy that Balaji used yesterday is that a lot of these banks are already dead, and the Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and First Republic were just the first ones that float to the surface. So if they keep rates high, I think we're going to see some more bank failures. Which maybe that's what they want. Who knows with these? But I got a tweet pulled up from Ryan Selkis in the White House. Came out with another report on crypto right now, and he did a great job summarizing. He said, "This industry we've been trying to destroy, grown to $1 trillion in value, and that rallied 30% as our banking system required a $2 trillion backstop. and in 10 years added 10,000s of American jobs, has no value or good qualities. I thought that was great because, if you read the report, they have an agenda, right? And this to me is the complete opposite of what the United States should be. Should be embracing this technology. And I say it all the time, instead of, it's like they're trying to stop the wind. Instead of building a wall, we should be building sails, right? To harness
Yes.
this. And it's just, they're taking the complete wrong approach to this. And, you alluded to before when we were talking before we started this, they've got donors, they've got people that they need to keep happy. And so a lot of this is just them doing that. But, how nice would it be to have, government that understood the power of this technology, that did the work to really understand it, instead of, a government and government agencies constantly attacking, this industry, right? It's just, again, but that goes back to, the ethos of Bitcoin and crypto is that, it can exist outside the system. And I get frustrated a lot too with, you've had a lot of crypto people all of a sudden become like macro experts, all this stuff. And it's like, guys, like, I guess that's what happens when you grow, right? The industry's grown big enough to now where we're a relevant factor and got to pay attention. But,
Yeah, another thing that, like, when I read the Selkis, is it Selkis?
yes.
That tweet, and I read.
We lost your audio, Ted. We can't hear you. We lost your audio. All right, we lost Ted's audio. What happened? Cannot hear Ted. But yeah, I thought this was just a great way, kind of, in a one sentence summary, because, you don't, at this point, you almost don't even have to read it to know negative. And he brought up great point, right? You're talking about tens of thousands of American jobs. It's just the attacks, I think, are unwarranted. Really do. Now, if this was a different type of industry that added tens of thousands of jobs over the past few years, they'd be taking credit for it, which they should do, right? I mean, that's the smart thing to do. See if that worked.
All right.
Yep, we can hear you now.
All right, super. Yeah, the Streamlabs did not like my earbuds anymore. But anyway, the thing I was trying to say is that the administration has their agenda set for them. They listen, they look at data. I mean, you can't, I guess you can't fault the current administration for making data-driven decisions about how they're going to operate and what they're going to say. So factoring that in doesn't mean we have to like what they have to say. And the thing I'm trying to get to is that doesn't matter that they're acting or the things that they're publishing and the posture that our industry is the enemy, basically. And all I really have to say at this point is that, as Sun Tzu would say, is that you should not ever disrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake, because that's fundamentally what's happening. Is the current administration are making a mistake. Instead of building sails, they're trying to defend the moat that is currently, and this is really, it's the banking industry and the banking industry's lobby, who money, and just follow the money. Like in any good crime drama, they follow the money, and they look when they're looking for motive. And so the motive here is simply the banking industry pays lobbyists. Lobbyists go to DC. They press the flesh. They distribute the lobbying funds, which is just the way things are done. And they say, these things are currently a threat, and we want you to legislate and posture and position against them and influence the public to be afraid of the following: A, B, C, and D. And you think about all the money, all of the US dollars that don't flow when they are being consumed by digital assets outside of the current system. And you think about all the fees that are not getting generated, all of the financial products that people are not consuming because they're not participating in the financial system in a traditional way. And it's a pretty simple math problem, is that when the banking industry's wallet gets light, they get upset. And they put money to work by paying people to orchestrate FUD. If you're a writer for the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, you write about what your boss tells you to write about. You don't get to choose. That's just the way it is. And
Yeah, it's
the
unfortunate. I mean, it just
when you get in the way of how the money flows and how it's been flowing, it causes problems and for people. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the pain float to the surface in these ways. And so anyway, I think the chaos creates opportunity. So all this chaos right now is creating an opportunity for others that get it, like the DeSantis's of the world, the guy, I think is his name, and then the other, like the Loomises, the Ted Cruzes, and all of the other people that participate in the political system, or that they're elected officials that are allegedly have America's interest in mind, meaning freedom, leading the way, being innovators, and building sails, not building walls, and finding ways to stay ahead of the innovation curve. And as where I think I look at I call it innovation curve just in my head, and we're falling. Well, the current administration is there's the clock is ticking. There's only so much time left before the next election cycle really ramps up, and I think now's the time for us, and people like us and people that care, and don't like that. If you have basically you have a problem with how things have been going, you have the opportunity to get off your butt and open your mouth and have some skin in the game. Write to your Congress people, write to your senators, write to the states and local governments are the current battleground, in my opinion. And that's someone else's like words. What's his name? The guy on Twitter, Dennis. What's his name? I forget.
yeah.
I don't have it pulled up.
I stopped listening a long time ago, to be honest.
Well, he made a good point. I still pay attention to what he says, not because not because I agree with every syllable, but
No, that's true. You don't have to.
I mean, he made a good point about the states, and I think it's interesting timing that DeSantis had a huge press conference. I don't know how huge it ended up being, but he went on the record now in public, saying we are going to outlaw CDBCs. We're going to stop federal government overreach, which is a language that regular people understand. And I think there's enough support. Well, I think there was enough support for this already in Florida, for example, that the governor was willing to go on the record in mainstream media at large, because now this has been etched into the record. And if he missteps in the future, there'll be thousands of people that'll reference this thing, and all this energy will get expended screaming and yelling on Twitter. But the point I'm trying to make is that the foundation and framework for putting up a fight is now laid, and it's materializing in the form of no CDBCs, because it is a federal government overreach, and it infringes on your freedom. And I think that's real life, and that is the reality. And that's what we need to really help people understand, perhaps, is that you do not want what the current administration is proposing. And maybe it's just like the last gasp, because they understand that politically they're becoming less and less relevant as we get towards the end of this particular cycle and the next election season begins.
Yeah,
Just
I mean, you're going to start to see this play out in the different states, right? Like, you know, you have Texas and Florida being very active against CBDCs and coming out and making statements. I've got a tweet pulled up from Balaji here, and he basically says the infinite money is here. How we got here is a matter of history. The question is how to get out. Fed is launching their CBDC in July. You have about 90 days to exit. After that, you're trapped in a devalued digital dollar. There'll be a digital lockdown or Bitcoin independence. And I think that's the important takeaway here is that, you know, what it appears they're trying to do is get money out of smaller regional banks into bigger banks, right? And then once all the money's there, and they implement what's called Fed Now in July, which is somewhat of a precursor. And I saw a great tweet last night from George Gammon. He basically said that, you know, they understand there's enough pushback against the term CBDC. They're going to implement this. They're just not going to call it a CBDC, right? This will be implemented and it'll just be called the dollar, right? And so, you know, if your money is in these big banks and they implement this, you're trapped. If they don't want you to buy certain things, you're not going to be able to, right? And that's the scary part. What Balaji is saying is essentially, you got about 90 days to get your money out of the system if you want to before that happens. Now, we don't know for sure. You know, it's impossible for any of us normal guys to know what they're actually doing. All we can go off of is what they've said. And it certainly looks like they're making a push to try to do this, right? Like you just talked about, the administration's time is almost up. You know, this is a big goal for them. They whatever anybody says, all these people care about is control and power, right? And that's what a CBDC, whatever they want to call it, allows them to do. And so when you look at somebody like Balaji, who's kind of raising the alarm for this, you really have to pay attention, because there's a great video he did with Anthony Pompliano on YouTube. It's about an hour long, where he describes this, and he basically brings, you know, they call it bringing the receipts, you know, his reasoning why he's saying this. He's not pulling it out of his ass, right? This isn't some guy this isn't a John McAfee style, you know, bet. Like, he's got actual reasoning, and based off what's actually happening, as to why he believes, you know, Bitcoin could see $1 million in 90 days. Now, when you listen to him talk, basically what he's just trying to do is bring attention to the fact that this is all happening. And, you know, I think it's a great way to do that.
Yes, I agree. And I think one of the most important, like in my mind, one of the most important things that I factor in when I think about all of this jaw flapping and posturing in public about the Fed Now program, and which the undercurrent is the CBDC, is that the average person doesn't understand where dollars come from in the first place. So it's easy for them to talk about this, knowing that the marginalized at the fringe folks are going to scream and scream and scream, but the mainstream are just gonna, they're not going to understand it, but they're going to be too afraid to ask. And if you call the bank, for example, and say, I heard this thing was coming, and what do you think the banks are going to say? Like, they're not going to say, I recommend that you don't participate in this because it's basically a government surveillance trap. That's not what, no one at a bank is going to say that, because they don't want to get fired.
Well, and your financial advisor's not going to know that either. I mean, those guys, you know, they've made a really good living investing in mutual funds, right? And the market goes up, you go up, and, you know, the key takeaway here, in my opinion, is you got to do your own research. You got to get out there. You got to find leading voices that aren't necessarily mainstream. Start to pay attention to what people are doing, right? To take control of your own financial future.
Yeah, and you know, the one of the, you know, the scary thing is, like, I imagine if, you know, if I had a family and children and they were, you know, in the school system, and, you know, I'm on the hook for my mortgage. I've got a family to provide for. I mean, I have a different type of family. My wife and I don't have human children. We have four-legged canine children. But it's not the same, though, as raising a family with, like, human lives at stake. Is the one thing I try to factor this into my own thinking, because specifically because it's not my reality, but it is the reality for a lot of people. And I've over the last decade, as I've gone from my 30s into my 40s, I've watched people's lives take shape wholly around their children. And this is not a commentary on having children. This is a commentary on the reality of having children and how everything blossoms and grows out of from that. And I think there's a statistically significant number of people raising families with children, and they don't a lot of them don't understand like where the real risks are, so they just play it safe, and they're like, well, if
Well,
the government says
they're
it's
busy, man. That's the thing. Like,
that is exactly that's the next point I was going to make, is that both parents work, they're financially dependent on their employers, so and so much so that if they make one misstep, and that means they can't pay for daycare, they can't pay for food, they can't pay for housing, they can't pay for transportation. There's like there's security, like whether it's food security, energy security, all these things that matter in life at the basic levels here. All of those things are constantly on this low level threat based on like their the actions they take and the immediacy of the consequences. So it's really easy to, for government officials to get up in front of the media and say, well, if you don't comply with our program, then it directly affects, I mean, and not in so many words, but basically your ability to provide for your family and your ability to survive are going to be in jeopardy if you don't do what we say.
right. Well, that's fear. It's fear. It's propaganda. It's what they've used for their entire life, their entire being, right? And that's what we're trying to get away from, and to the extent that you can, right? And that's why it's important that even if you are busy like that, to take an hour a day or 30 minutes a day and start researching this stuff, because unfortunately it's happening, right? And to the scale it's happening, I can't tell you, Ted can't tell you, but we're in a position now where, because of decisions made by unelected officials, quite frankly, during the pandemic and over the past, 10, 15 years too, where we find ourselves on the brink again. And it's important for people to understand that, not to be scared, because there's options, right? And as long as you kind of take some of that money that, or, I guess what I'm trying to say is, if you can get some of the money out of the system, right? And get it in what we think is a lifeboat, maybe some of this worry and fear kind of subsides. I know personally, because of decisions I've made, I don't, it doesn't really bother me right now, right? Like what's happening, right? Because you kind of see it coming. And the reason it bothers me is because I don't know what they're going to do, but I can't control that. All I can control is the actions that I take, right? And so that's the thing people need to start paying attention. What can you do now to ensure into the future that you're not going to be subject to whatever administration is in power? And that's what we were just talking about, that is happening right now with this administration and what they're trying to implement here. Once this happens, if this happens, you don't have any more optionality. You're stuck. You have to do what they say. You can't say you are a supporter of Donald Trump and you tweet something and they ding your bank account for 10%. Or, this is pretty extreme, but, say the government comes out and mandates that you attend 3 hours a week of trans people education, right? And if you don't go there and learn about this stuff, they deduct 10% out of your bank account, right? This is the world we're heading to, the world we're pushing to, and it's scary, and it's getting rejected, and it should get rejected. The problem is that they're going to be sneaky about it. They're going to do stuff under the table. They're going to try to get this implemented whether we want it or not, right? And so they're going to have a scapegoat. If you have a total system collapse, my bet is they try to blame it on crypto. They're already trying. You can see the tea leaves, right? Even though crypto has nothing to do with this, this thing is failing, whether crypto existed or not. But that's the stuff that I think about and interests me. And Ted, I know you do too. So that's the kind of stuff we want to help people kind of get their.
I think to summarize is that don't wait, allocate. And that's what I think Balaji is saying, is that if you wait around, you'll find out. And the best way to to be protected is to allocate to something outside the system, which is impartial, doesn't care, about your politics. Bitcoin doesn't care about your politics. It doesn't care about your genetic makeup. It doesn't care what you think you are. It all it knows is that you are allocating into it, and you can hold your own. You literally can take possession of your asset, and in ways that you cannot today with things like bonds and stocks and even gold and uh, what was the other thing that people are buying, like derivatives. I mean, you think you're safe. You think your money's safe in the current system, and the cracks and the issues are like there it's things are not it's not healthy in the slightest. And that's not me sounding alarmist. That's just me pointing out that we've watched since the last financial crisis near collapse, the things that have happened, and here we are yet again. And
It's scary. I mean, it
yeah,
really
so
is.
don't wait, allocate. And if you don't know, ask somebody. Like, this isn't it isn't right. You don't have to know how the watch was made to know what time it is. So if you don't know what time it is, if I'll tell you what time it is. It's Bitcoin o'clock, and it's time to open your eyes and find some like-minded people that are interested in and or want to help themselves, but help other people understand why this might be a good idea. It doesn't affect my position. It doesn't affect Joss's position. It doesn't make anybody else wealthy in traditional terms for you to buy a little Bitcoin and protect yourself. This is about like you wouldn't drive your car without insurance, and hopefully you don't drive your car without wearing your seatbelt. In the same way, you wouldn't leave your cash in a glass briefcase sitting on the street in public. You would put it away somewhere safe. And what we're proposing and what I'm suggesting here is that if you want to protect some of your cash that you have, that today isn't a surveillance device, although in the being in a bank, anybody can look at your statements. All they got to do is make the right case to the right law enforcement agency, and boom. But what I'm suggesting is that if you believe in freedom and you believe in looking out for yourself, you can you can take steps to protect against government overreach. And what America's about is freedom. And you can allocate, instead of waiting, start allocating, ask for help, and somebody will help you, in my
One
opinion.
last thing here. I wanted to pull up Arthur Hayes did a podcast with Bankless. I haven't listened yet, but both Bankless and Arthur Hayes are great people to follow. And here, we're going to get Arthur's take on Bitcoin going to a million and USD going to zero. He's another guy. He started BitMEX. He's been around crypto for a long time. Made a lot of money. Smart dude. He has a lot. He writes a lot. Great person to follow. He's a little aggressive at times, which I enjoy. Not everybody does enjoy that style, but I certainly do. So I think that's a great place to leave it. Check out the Balaji Pomp interview on YouTube. I'm going to check this one out today. Listen to what Arthur Hayes has to say about it, and it'll be interesting to see if we start getting some confluence with these people, because it's not a small bet, right? It's not one of those things where it definitely worked. It grabbed everybody's attention. So I think that's a great place to kind of wrap it up today. As always, do your own research. None of this is financial advice, just information. So that being said, Ted, any last words?
Don't wait, allocate.
All right. Sounds good. I'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Sounds good. I'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks, everybody.